Hello, my name is Caleb Whitmore. Worthless. That was the word Douglas Hale used, standing in his polished kitchen, coffee mug raised like a judge's gavel, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. His friends, his family, my wife. I stood there, hands at my sides, feeling the familiar heat of humiliation crawl up my spine. Marissa stared at her plate, stirring eggs that had long gone cold, as if silence could erase a sentence spoken out loud. No one stopped him. No one corrected him. I'd built my life on being unseen, on letting people underestimate me. But in that moment, as his words settled into the room and no one objected, I felt something shift. How long can a man stay invisible before he disappears entirely? I learned early that power doesn't need an audience. Most people mistake noise for strength. They talk loud, list titles, drop numbers into conversations like business cards. I went the other way. I learned how to disappear. My name is Caleb Whitmore. I'm 38 years old. And for the last 12 years, I've built a private investment firm called Northfall Capital, based out of the Denver Tech Center. On paper, I'm barely there. No flashy website, no interviews, no conference panels. Just layers of holding companies, blind trusts, and legal buffers stacked neatly on top of each other. Enough distance that even good attorneys need time to follow the trail. That wasn't paranoia, it was preference. When you stay invisible, people show you who they really are. I manage a little over $200 million. Early stage tech, biotech, medical platforms that don't survive on hype, only patience. I've watched companies double quietly while louder competitors burn themselves out chasing attention. I've made my money the same way I live my life. Controlled, unremarkable on the surface, effective underneath. And yet, every Sunday night, I walked into Douglas Hale's house like a man with nothing to his name. Greenwood Village had a certain smell to it. Freshly cut lawns, expensive cologne, entitlement disguised as success. Douglas loved hosting dinners there, granite countertops, framed magazine covers from his better years, subtle reminders of who mattered in that room. I never corrected him when he introduced me. "This is Caleb," he'd say, waving a dismissive hand. "He works in finance," or something like that. People smiled politely, asked vague questions, lost interest quickly. Douglas mistook discretion for deficiency. In his world, if you didn't announce your worth, you didn't have any. I let him believe that. Marissa used to tell me it didn't bother her, that her father was just blunt, old school, protective. She'd squeeze my hand under the table, a silent apology she never translated into words. Then she'd go quiet again, eyes down, shoulders slightly curved inward, like a woman bracing for weather she'd grown used to. I noticed how often she chose peace over truth. We lived in Fort Collins, nearly an hour away from her parents. A modest house on a quiet street. Nothing that hinted at money. That was intentional, too. I liked knowing my neighbors by name. I liked walking into a coffee shop where no one cared what I did for a living. That version of me made sense. The version Douglas saw didn't. To him, I was a placeholder husband. A man who slipped through the cracks of the social hierarchy he worshipped. Someone safe to diminish because there would be no consequences. He was wrong, but not about everything. I had chosen silence, chosen not to explain, chosen not to draw lines. I told myself it was strategy, that enduring small humiliations preserved larger advantages. That love meant patience. Standing in his kitchen that night, hearing the word worthless land without resistance, I realized something uncomfortable. Invisibility is powerful, but only if you control when it ends. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen when I stopped letting them look through me. Douglas Hale believed the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who mattered and those who were tolerated. He never said it that cleanly, of course. He didn't need to. It lived in the way he corrected waiters mid-sentence, in how he interrupted conversations he found boring, in the way his laughter grew louder when he thought he was being admired. Douglas was 64 and still introduced himself as the founder and CEO of Virexon Biotech, even though the title had started to feel more nostalgic than accurate. The company had been bleeding quietly for years, but you wouldn't know it from the way he talked. Success to Douglas was a performance. If you kept acting like you were winning, eventually people would stop asking questions. His house reflected that belief. Everything was polished, everything curated. Awards mounted at eye level. Photos with people whose names carried weight in certain rooms. He liked hosting dinners because it put him at the center of a table where no one could ignore him. Those dinners followed a pattern. First came the pleasantries, work updates, golf stories. Then, once the wine loosened his restraint, Douglas would start sorting people. Compliments for those he respected, jokes for those beneath him, and sooner or later, his attention would land on me. "So, Caleb," he'd say, leaning back in his chair, "still doing whatever it is you do?" Laughter would ripple politely, never cruel enough to call out, never kind enough to stop. Marissa would smile tightly and change the subject. She was good at that. She'd learned early how to redirect her father without challenging him. It was survival. I understood that. What I didn't understand was how often survival became her default response, even when it cost something else. That night, there was an extra guest. Landon Pierce sat 2 seats down from me, invited as a potential strategic partner for Virexon. He was in his early 40s, dressed simply, watching more than he spoke. I noticed him because he didn't laugh when Douglas took his shots. He'd pause instead, sip his drink, let the silence stretch just a beat longer than comfortable. Douglas didn't notice. He never did. "You know," Douglas continued, carving into his steak with unnecessary force, "Marissa could have married anyone. Doctors, attorneys, people with real trajectories. But she's always had a soft heart." He glanced at me, smiled like he was being generous. "Practical choices aren't her strength." My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Marissa's shoulders stiffened. For a moment I thought she might say something. Her lips parted. Then she looked at her plate again. "I think Caleb's very steady," she said finally. The word landed wrong, like a consolation prize. Douglas waved it off. "Steady doesn't build legacies." Landon shifted in his seat. I caught his eye for half a second. There was discomfort there, recognition, the look of someone witnessing a line being crossed and realizing no one planned to address it. That was the part that stayed with me later, not Douglas's words. His words were predictable. It was the fact that an outsider could see the imbalance clearly, while the people closest to it pretended it was normal. On the drive home, Marissa apologized, quietly, automatically. "He doesn't mean it the way it sounds," she said. "You know how he is." I did know how he was. That wasn't the question. The question was why she kept translating his behavior into something more palatable, as if softening the edges could change the shape of the blade. That night, lying awake beside her, I realized Douglas's power didn't come from money or status. It came from the unspoken agreement that no one would challenge him, not his colleagues, not his staff, and not his daughter. And as long as that agreement held, he would keep mistaking silence for consent, including mine. The first time I realized Marissa wouldn't defend me, it was Christmas. Our first Christmas as a married couple. Snow packed the streets of Greenwood Village. Lights wrapped too tightly around trees that didn't need help looking impressive. Douglas had already opened a bottle of wine before we arrived. By the time dinner was served, he was warm, loose, and eager. "So, Caleb," he said, swirling his glass, "let's try this again. What exactly do you do?" I gave him the same answer I always did. Private investments, portfolio management, consulting. All true, all incomplete. He smiled like he'd caught me lying. That's a lot of words for not much substance. A few people chuckled. Someone cleared their throat. I felt Marissa tense beside me. "He works in finance, Dad," she said quickly, still smiling, still trying to keep the temperature down. Douglas leaned forward. "Finance means anything. Could be insurance. Could be some strip mall office managing retirement accounts for teachers." I waited. I didn't look at him. I looked at Marissa. She laughed softly. Too softly. "You're exaggerating." That was it. That was the moment. Not because she agreed with him, but because she chose correction without confrontation. Because she smoothed the insult instead of stopping it. Because she framed it as humor when it wasn't. Later that night, after we drove back to Fort Collins, she cried. Told me she was sorry. Told me he didn't understand boundaries. Told me it would get better. I believed her, or maybe I wanted to. But it didn't get better. It became a pattern. Every dinner came with a comment. Every holiday with a comparison. Doctors, lawyers, men who spoke loudly about their achievements and parked expensive cars in front of houses they barely lived in. Douglas admired them because they looked successful in ways he understood. I stayed quiet. I told myself it wasn't worth correcting him, that my life didn't need his validation, that love required tolerance. What I didn't admit was how often I checked Marissa's face in those moments, waiting for something, a sentence, a line drawn. It never came. She'd apologize later. In the car, in bed, in whispers meant only for me. She'd say she hated conflict, that her father shut down when challenged, that pushing him only made things worse. What she never said was that challenging him might cost her something she wasn't willing to lose. I started to see it in smaller ways. How she introduced me at events. How she softened my accomplishments. How she'd emphasize my stability instead of my ambition. As if she were managing expectations before anyone could be disappointed. It wasn't malice, it was fear and convenience and habit. But fear doesn't make silence harmless. One night after a particularly brutal dinner, I asked her directly, "Why don't you ever tell him to stop?" She stared at the wall for a long time before answering, "Because it won't change him." That's not what I asked. She looked at me then, really looked, and for a second I thought she understood what I was asking her to risk. "I just want everyone to get along," she said. That was when I realized we were fighting two different battles. I was fighting for dignity. She was fighting for equilibrium. And equilibrium, I was learning, often came at the expense of the person least willing to disrupt it. I didn't stop loving her, but something shifted. A quiet recalibration. I began to notice how often I absorbed discomfort so she wouldn't have to. How many moments passed where my silence made her life easier. I told myself it was temporary. That marriage was compromise. That things would eventually balance out. But deep down, I knew the truth. Every time she stayed silent, she was choosing something. And it wasn't me. The irony didn't hit me all at once. It crept in quietly, the way inconvenient truths usually do. I first came across Virexin Biotech 8 months earlier, not as my father-in-law's company, but as a line item buried in a market report. Mid-sized biotech, decent research history, weak balance sheet, aggressive burn rate. The kind of company that survived more on reputation than revenue. I flagged it out of habit. At Northfall, we tracked dozens of firms like that every quarter. Most never made it past the first screen. Virexon did, not because it was healthy, but because it was close to something valuable and dangerously close to losing it. The deeper I looked, the worse it got. Cash reserves shrinking, venture funding stretched thin, debt structured in ways that bought time but not stability. They'd missed projections 3 quarters in a row and quietly pushed back internal milestones without telling anyone outside the boardroom. Someone was bleeding money and calling it strategy. It took me longer than it should have to connect the dots. I didn't want to. Compartmentalization is easy when it's convenient. Then I saw Douglas Hale's name, founder, CEO, majority voting control. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen for a long time. So this was it. The empire. The legacy he talked about like it was untouchable. From a distance, it was fragile. I initiated due diligence through a shell entity, nothing that could be traced back to me or Northfall. That was standard. The less people knew, the cleaner the process stayed. Over the next few months, my team pulled everything. Financials, internal memos, board notes, product timelines. What emerged wasn't fraud or incompetence. It was something more common. Ego. 18 months earlier, Virexin had rushed a neurotropin compound toward clinical trials despite internal resistance. The research team had flagged instability issues, data gaps, regulatory risk. The warnings were detailed and unanimous. Douglas overruled them. The launch failed exactly the way the scientists predicted. The FDA rejection cost Virexin nearly $3 million and 2 strategic partnerships. Instead of owning the mistake, Douglas cleaned house. Senior researchers were pushed out. Blame was reassigned downward. The narrative was controlled. That was when I saw Marissa's name, buried in an internal document, a dissenting analysis attached to the original recommendation against the launch. 20 pages, clear, precise, unemotional. She'd been right. I closed the file and leaned back, the room suddenly very quiet. She'd never told me this part. She'd mentioned disagreements, differences in approach, nothing about being sidelined, nothing about being blamed, nothing about leaving because staying had become unbearable. At home, she framed it as a career pivot, a mutual decision. I hadn't pushed. I trusted her to tell me what mattered. Now I understood why she hadn't. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying dinners at Douglas's house, his confidence, his contempt, the way he spoke about intelligence as if it belonged only to him, the way Marissa shrank when he talked over her. By the end of the week, Northfall had a proposal ready. $15 million, enough to stabilize Virexin, enough to give Douglas room to maneuver, enough to quietly erase the consequences of his decisions. The investment made sense on paper. The upside was real if leadership changed course, if humility entered the equation. But humility wasn't Douglas Hale's currency. I hadn't committed yet. The documents sat unsigned, locked behind layers of approval that only I could move. I told myself I was being thorough, careful. The truth was simpler. I was watching, waiting. Every dinner, every insult, every moment Marissa chose silence over confrontation added weight to a decision she didn't know she was part of. Douglas thought his salvation would come from someone important, someone visible, someone he respected. He never considered that the man he dismissed at his own table might be the only one standing between him and collapse. And for the first time since I'd married his daughter, I stopped asking myself how much I could endure. I started asking what would happen if I didn't. Marissa's birthday fell on a Saturday that year, and Douglas insisted on hosting. He framed it as generosity, said he wanted to make it special. What he meant was that he wanted an audience. The house was full when we arrived, colleagues from Verexen, country club friends, a few extended relatives who only showed up when there was something to celebrate or something to show off. Music played softly in the background. Wine flowed freely. Everything looked warm and polished, like a catalog version of happiness. Marissa smiled the way she always did at these things. Grateful, tense, performing balance. I watched her move through the room, accepting compliments, laughing on cue. She looked beautiful. She always did. But there was a tightness around her eyes I'd learned to recognize. The look she wore when she was bracing herself. Dinner was loud. Stories overlapped. Douglas held court at the head of the table, talking about market conditions, bad leadership in the industry, how hard it was to find people with real vision these days. Landon Pierce sat across from me again. Same reserved posture, same careful attention. He nodded when appropriate, but his eyes kept drifting, tracking the room rather than the conversation. He noticed things. That mattered. Halfway through the meal, Douglas raised his glass. "A toast," he announced, "to my daughter. Brilliant, driven, capable of so much more than she ever gives herself credit for." Applause followed. Marissa blushed. Douglas continued, warming to the moment. "She's published more papers than most people in this room will ever read. Speaks at conferences people fly across the country to attend." He paused, looked at me. "And yet," he said, smiling, "life's about choices, isn't it?" The table quieted. I felt it before anyone said anything. That familiar shift in the air. "She could have married anyone," Douglas went on. "Doctors, lawyers, men with clear trajectories, men who don't hide behind vagueness." A few people laughed, uncertain. Someone took a sip of wine a little too quickly. Marissa's hand tightened around her fork. Douglas leaned back, satisfied. But we all settle in our own ways. I waited. I waited for Marissa to interrupt, to say my name, to say stop, to do anything that acknowledged the line he'd crossed. She didn't. Her eyes stayed fixed on the tablecloth, her shoulders pulled inward. Silence stretched, thick and unmistakable. Landon set his glass down. The sound cut sharper than anything Douglas had said. He didn't smile, didn't look away. He looked at Marissa instead. She never looked up. Something inside me finally clicked into place. Not anger, not hurt. Clarity. I stood slowly, the movement drawing attention despite my intention not to. Conversations died off. Douglas turned toward me, eyebrows raised, already amused. "You're absolutely right," I said calmly. The room froze. Marissa does deserve better. A few people gasped. Someone whispered her name. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. She smelled like lavender and something sweet from the cake. Familiar. Painfully so. "I hope you find it," I said quietly. Then I picked up my coat and walked out. I heard my name behind me. A chair scraping. Panic breaking through the polished surface of the evening. I didn't turn around. Outside, the night air was cold and clean. My breath fogged as I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel cruel. I felt Finished. By the time I reached my car, I knew something irreversible had just happened. Not because I'd spoken, but because I'd finally stopped waiting for someone else to speak for me. And once that line was crossed, there was no version of this story where I went back to pretending. I drove home without music. The roads were empty, the kind of quiet Colorado night that usually calmed me. That night, it didn't. My hands were steady on the wheel, my thoughts precise, almost clinical. What surprised me wasn't how much clarity I felt. It was how long it had taken to arrive. By the time I pulled into our driveway in Fort Collins, the house was dark. Marissa wasn't home. I sat in the car for a while, engine off, watching my breath fog the windshield. For months, maybe years, I'd been bracing myself for an explosion, a confrontation, a breaking point filled with shouting and regret. Instead, this felt like a controlled demolition. Inside, the house looked exactly the same. Her shoes by the door. A half-finished book on the coffee table. Evidence of a life paused mid-sentence. I took off my coat, poured a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen counter like it was any other night. Then I opened my laptop. The investment documents were already there. $15 million. Structured through 3 layers of entities. Clean. Legal. Anonymous. The kind of deal that could save Virexon without ever touching Douglas Hale's ego. I'd reviewed them dozens of times, each pass framed as caution, diligence, patience. Now there was nothing left to consider. The next morning, I drove to my office early. Denver Tech Center was quiet at that hour, glass buildings catching the first light of the day. I liked being there before anyone else arrived. It reminded me that momentum didn't need witnesses. Victor Langford was already waiting. He didn't ask how I was. He never did. He slid a folder across the table and watched my face. "You're sure?" he asked. "Once we pull this, there's no resetting the board." "I'm sure." He nodded. No judgment, no surprise, just confirmation. We went through it step by step. Formal withdrawal of interest, termination of the pending agreement, a timed delivery to Virexon's legal counsel. Everything clean, everything defensible, no emotion on paper, just facts. 10 a.m. tomorrow, Victor said. That's when they'll know something's wrong. They won't know who yet. That's fine, I said. They don't need to. I left the office feeling lighter than I had in months. Marissa came home that evening around 8. She looked exhausted, eyes red, movements tentative, like she wasn't sure which version of the night she was walking into. "We need to talk," she said. We sat across from each other in the living room, the space between us suddenly formal. "My dad called," she said carefully. "He thinks he went too far." I almost smiled. "He wants to apologize," she continued. "Maybe we could have dinner this weekend, just the 3 of us. Reset things." I studied her face, waiting to see if she understood what had actually happened the night before. Waiting for anger, for resolve, for anything that suggested she'd crossed the same line I had. She hadn't. "Marissa," I said, "how long have you been ashamed of me?" Her head snapped up. "What? I'm not ashamed." "You've never told him to stop. Not once." "He doesn't mean it," she said quickly. "He just gets carried away. He called me worthless in front of everyone." She looked down. I didn't know what to say. That was the answer. An hour later, she packed a bag, said she needed space, said things were too raw. I didn't stop her. There was nothing left to negotiate. After she left, I stood alone in the living room, listening to the quiet settle back into place. Somewhere in Greenwood Village, Douglas Hale still believed the world bent toward him. Somewhere in Boulder, Virexon's books still pretended to balance. They had one more night before reality arrived, and for the first time, I didn't feel responsible for softening the impact. I woke up before my alarm. That wasn't unusual, but the stillness felt different, lighter, like something had already been decided while I slept. By the time I reached my office, the sun was just starting to rise over the tech center. I poured myself bad coffee and checked my phone. No messages from Marissa. No missed calls. The quiet confirmed what I already knew. She was still thinking this was about hurt feelings, about pride, about smoothing things over. At exactly 10 o'clock, I called Victor. "It's done," he said. "Withdrawal notice delivered. Clean receipt." "Thank you." I hung up and stared at the window for a moment. Somewhere in Boulder, a legal team was opening an email that didn't make sense yet. Somewhere else, Douglas Hale was still confident the world would behave the way it always had. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. "Caleb?" Marissa's voice was tight, unsteady. "Something's wrong." I stayed quiet. "Dad's company just lost their primary investor," she said. $15 million. They won't say who it was. The lawyers are citing confidentiality issues, and now they're talking about breach clauses. He's panicking. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said evenly. There was a pause. I could hear her breathing. "I know you work in finance," she continued. "Do you think you could ask around? See if anyone knows which group pulled out?" The irony was almost elegant. "I'll see what I can do," I said. After we hung up, I drafted 2 text messages. Short, direct, no explanations. I scheduled them for 10 a.m. the following morning. One to Marissa, one to Douglas. Victor would send a third at the same time. That evening, I stayed late at the office and went back through Varexen's files one last time. Not because I needed to, because I wanted certainty. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. The failed launch, the ignored data, the scientists pushed out for telling the truth. Douglas hadn't just made a bad call. He'd made the same bad call over and over, convinced confidence could substitute for competence. I called Dr. Elaine Crowder around 8. She didn't hesitate. "Douglas Hale is a liability," she said. "Brilliant people, solid research, but he runs that place on ego. He never listens, especially when a woman tells him he's wrong." "What about Marissa?" I asked. Elaine exhaled slowly. "She warned him, in writing. He dismissed it. When things went bad, he made her life impossible." I thanked her and ended the call. I sat there long after the office emptied, thinking about how many versions of the truth Marissa had carried alone. How many times she'd learned that speaking up came with consequences. It didn't excuse her silence with me, but it explained it. Still, explanation wasn't absolution. The next morning, I called her at 9:45. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "I need you to sit down," I said. "You're scaring me." "I'm the investor who pulled out of Varexon." Silence. "I own Northfall Capital," I continued. "We were prepared to invest $15 million. I withdrew the offer yesterday." "That's not possible," she said. "You don't. Check your phone in 12 minutes. She started crying before the call ended. When the messages went through, everything accelerated. Pleading, anger, bargaining. Marissa begged me to reconsider, said I was destroying her father, that I was being cruel. "This isn't about cruelty," I said. "It's about consequences." She hung up. Douglas called next. He didn't bother with greetings. "You think you're clever?" he shouted. "You think this is funny?" "I think you finally understand the situation," I said. There was a long pause. "What do you want?" he asked, smaller now. Nothing. I ended the call and turned my phone off. 3 days later, Marissa filed for divorce. By then, there was nothing left to explain. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It spread. The first sign was silence. The kind that follows a public fracture when people don't know which version of the story is safe to repeat. My phone stayed quiet for days. No calls from Douglas, no messages from Marissa. Just the low hum of consequences moving through rooms I wasn't in anymore. Then, the industry started talking. Virexon's troubles leaked the way they always do. Not through press releases or official statements, but through closed-door conversations and careful emails that began with phrases like, off the record, and between us. The mysterious withdrawal of their primary investor made people nervous. Nervous investors don't wait for explanations. 2 more firms pulled out within a week. Landon Pierce was one of the first. I didn't hear it from him directly. I heard it the way these things travel, through a mutual contact who mentioned it casually, like an afterthought. He wouldn't touch it, the contact said. Said leadership was the problem, not the money. That mattered more than any headline. Marissa came by the house while I was at work. She packed quietly, efficiently. When I came home, her things were gone. In their place was a letter on the kitchen counter. 2 pages, careful handwriting, controlled language. She said she couldn't be married to someone who would deliberately hurt her family. She said she loved me, but love wasn't enough to justify what I'd done. What she didn't say was that she'd finally confronted her father. I found that out later, through Elaine Crowder. According to her, Marissa had gone to Douglas's house unannounced. No mediation, no soft language. She told him exactly what she thought of his leadership, his arrogance, and the way he'd destroyed both her career and her marriage. When he tried to deflect, she didn't let him. She walked out and didn't answer his calls again. 17 times, Elaine told me. He'd called her 17 times. Within a month, Virexon laid off 8 employees and shuttered their secondary research facility. The local business journal ran a story focusing on governance failures and strategic missteps. Former employees were quoted anonymously. The picture wasn't kind. Douglas put his house on the market, sold the vacation place in Vail, let go of the landscaping service that used to keep everything pristine. One afternoon, I drove past and saw him pulling weeds from the front yard himself, bent, smaller, unrecognizable from the man who used to lecture me about success over dinner. 6 months later, Virexon filed for bankruptcy. Douglas found a consulting job shortly after. A small office near the airport. Strip mall. No signage worth mentioning. The kind of place you pass every day without noticing. Marissa moved to California, took a position at a research institute that valued her work. She started publishing again, speaking again. People listened. She never reached out to me. I sold the house in Fort Collins and relocated North Falls operations to Portland. New office, new rhythm, same philosophy, quiet work, clean decisions. I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned. Douglas Hale learned what it meant to be dismissed, to be underestimated, to need respect he no longer had leverage to demand. And I learned something too. Revenge is loud. Consequences are quiet. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is nothing at all. Time didn't soften what happened. It clarified it. A year passed without any dramatic turns, which felt appropriate. Real endings rarely announce themselves. They settle in quietly and stay. North Fall grew at a steady pace in Portland, the kind of growth that doesn't attract attention but compounds all the same. New deals, new founders, different problems. The work grounded me in something solid again. Every so often, I'd hear news about Douglas Hale through industry channels. Nothing official, just fragments. A failed advisory role. A project that never secured funding. A reputation that followed him into rooms before he ever opened his mouth. The man who once dominated conversations now struggled to get people to return his calls. No one said his name with admiration anymore. Marissa never contacted me, but I knew she was doing well. Mutual acquaintances mentioned her papers, her speaking engagements, the way her confidence seemed to return when she talked about her work. She'd reclaimed her voice in science, just not in our marriage. That used to bother me. Then it didn't. One afternoon, while walking along the river near my office, I thought about that night in Douglas's kitchen. The word he'd used so easily. Worthless. I realized it only had power because I'd accepted the premise long enough to let it settle. Respect, I learned, isn't demanded. It isn't inherited. It isn't something you get to define for other people. It's something you earn in the moments when you think no one is watching. Especially when you believe the person in front of you can't do anything about it. Douglas built his life believing power was permanent. I built mine knowing it was conditional. That difference changed everything. I don't regret loving Marissa. I regret mistaking silence for loyalty. I regret believing patience could substitute for self-respect. Those lessons came late, but they stayed. Sometimes people ask why I never corrected Douglas, why I let him believe I was less than I was. The answer is simple. I wanted to see how people behave when they think they're safe to be cruel. They always tell you who they are. And when the moment comes to decide whether you disappear or finally step into the light, you find out who you are too. I didn't destroy anyone. I stepped aside and let the truth do its work. In the end, the man who was called worthless walked away intact. The man who believed himself untouchable lost everything that made him matter. That's the part no one forgets.